Flames tore through Mabel's cabin as she sat barefoot in the dirt, clutching a scorched journal, whispering the names of the herbs she once grew. No one came to help. Jesse stood at the edge of the firelight, silent, watching. But what he returned with the next morning would silence the town and change everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The booth Mabel claimed each morning wasn't just a seat in a diner. It was a line she'd drawn around her world. Tucked in the farthest corner, half-shadowed beneath the window's warped glass, it faced no one and nothing. The wooden table bore soft gouges from years of idly running her spoon along its edge, and the cracked leather of the bench groaned just the way her knees did. She always ordered the same thing: oatmeal, black coffee, one hard biscuit, no butter. It wasn't a meal. It was a routine, carved out like a trench, protective in its sameness. She brought her sewing with her sometimes, not for show, never for that, but because the steadiness of her hands needed purpose, and thread didn't judge. Her fingers, thick at the joints and calloused, moved with the quiet grace of someone who'd stitched pain into something useful more times than she could count. Her beard, graying at the tips and curling slightly at the chin, softened her jawline in a way that should have looked regal if only the town allowed itself to see that. But it didn't. Darrow's Diner had a code, and Mabel broke it by existing. Children learned it early. Don't point, but don't smile either. Adults perfected the art of sidelong glances, just long enough to remind her she didn't belong, but short enough to pretend they hadn't looked. The waitress, Millie, always dropped her silverware louder than necessary. Once she accidentally brought Mabel a dirty cup and never apologized. Mabel drank from it anyway. She didn't fight these cruelties. She'd fought once, back when she believed people could be argued into kindness. That was before the bearded lady posters, before the pitying stares of the church women, before her own sister stopped answering letters. Larkspur was a town with church bells and white fences, and folks liked things to stay just so. They prided themselves on tidiness, as if morality lived in trimmed hedges and properly hemmed skirts. Mabel, with her wool shawls and slow smile, broke their reflection, and for that they chose to pretend she didn't exist, but every day she returned. The door's bell chimed the same way when she entered. The same cold seat, the same whisper behind a coffee cup. And yet, each morning, she took her place, straightened her napkin, and met the silence head-on. There was something heroic in that, though no one dared to say so. The first thing folks noticed about Jesse Boyd was how little he carried: a battered canvas roll, a dented tin cup, and the coat. An army green thing whose lining had come loose at the hem, like a man whose stitching was beginning to fail. His boots bore the kind of wear that only comes from miles walked alone, soles flattened by dust and silence. When he opened the door to Darrow's Diner that first morning, the warmth inside didn't welcome him. It recoiled. Not overtly, not with words. Just a moment's pause in conversation, a few forkfuls of eggs left hovering mid-air. He took no notice. He had the kind of face that looked carved rather than grown, sharp around the cheekbones, beard dusted with gray, lips set in that weathered line worn by men who've buried more dreams than they've shared. His eyes were a curious thing, not hard, but deeply still, like bark after rain. They didn't beg, didn't plead. They simply took measure of the room and moved on. No one invited him to sit. He didn't need to be invited. He picked the booth across from Mabel, not out of rebellion, but because it was unclaimed, and he didn't believe in avoiding shadows to appease the light. Millie, the waitress, sighed when she saw where he'd chosen, but he met her gaze without flinching, as though he knew exactly what kind of welcome a man like him could expect. He ordered coffee, nothing else, and set down 3 coins with the carefulness of someone for whom small change was hard-earned. The town whispered quick. Said he used to build fences for the Maddox Ranch but left after a fight. Others said he was a runaway from something darker. Larkspur didn't trust quiet men unless they were behind pulpits or counters. And Jesse Boyd, with his torn coat and wolfish stillness, didn't belong to either. For 3 days he sipped in silence, eyes trained out the window like he was watching for something only he could see. But on the 4th, when Millie let the biscuit plate clatter against Mabel's cup and curled her lip with that muttered insult, Jesse didn't raise his voice, but his words struck like flint on stone. That's no way to treat a queen. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't gallantry. It was truth, spoken plainly, as though anything less would have been dishonest. No one moved. Even the old clock above the register seemed to hesitate. Mabel didn't speak. She looked up, eyes meeting his, not with fear, but with a question long buried. "Why did you say that?" Jesse only nodded and took another sip of coffee, as if he'd merely commented on the weather. From then on, he sat across from her. No invitation, no explanation. Just two people sharing space carved out by rejection. Their silence was companionable. She sewed. He read. Sometimes he brought scraps of news, clippings of bearded women who owned theaters now, or sideshow men who bought farms in Kansas. And slowly, as the leaves crisped and the frost crept down the valley, the invisible space around them, once marked by shame and avoidance, began to warm. Not fast, but enough. The night Mabel's cabin burned was moonless. One of those suffocating country nights where silence feels thick, like the world is holding its breath. The fire didn't rage so much as it crept, licking along the porch slats before coiling inward, slow and sinister. No one called for help. No bucket brigade. No shouted warnings across the creek. By the time Jesse reached the edge of the woods, drawn by the distant glow, it was already too late. The townsfolk told themselves it had to be the lantern. A clumsy hand, an old wick, perhaps a frayed curtain fluttering too close. But everyone remembered the boys, teenagers with too much time and too little conscience, who'd jeered behind her pew the Sunday before. "Maybe she's a witch," one of them had laughed. Seen her talking to plants. And how they'd trailed her home afterward, faces half masked with smirks. The next day, the same boys strutted past Darrow's diner, one of them miming smoke with his hands. No one said a word. The sheriff came because it was required. He kicked around the embers scribbled in his pad, then shrugged and said, "Could be anything, no proof." The case was closed before the soot cooled. Jesse found her not in tears, but in stillness. She sat barefoot on a broken beam, the toes of her stockinged feet smudged black, her back straight as a fence post. In her lap was a warped, smoke-damaged journal, edges curled like old leaves. She held it like scripture, fingers trembling just enough to betray what she refused to say. Her lips moved in rhythm, barely audible, repeating the names of plants she had once nurtured on her windowsill. Lavender, thyme, snapdragons, lemon balm. He didn't offer pity. He offered presence. "Come on, Queen," he said softly. "We'll build you something better." And they did. With salvaged boards and bent nails, they raised walls that didn't apologize for their roughness. Jesse sawed and hammered. Mabel stitched, curtains of faded muslin, embroidered at the hem with tiny wildflowers. It wasn't charity. It was reclamation. The town watched in stiff silence. No one offered tools or hands. But what shook them wasn't the fire, or even her endurance. It was the bench. Plain pine, sanded smooth by Jesse's careful hands. He dragged it to the center of Larkspur's Square one dawn, before shops opened, before gossip could rise. On its backrest, carved with a pocket knife, were 11 simple words. Her name is Mabel. She built something beautiful. No fanfare, no permission. At first, people snickered. Sentimental nonsense, someone muttered by the general store. Folks'll forget by next week. But they didn't. They read it again and again, and something in them shifted, quietly, the way ice cracks beneath a spring sun. They remembered the curtains she mended for the church, the way her pies always tasted like memory, the kindness she gave freely in a town that offered none in return. They remembered her name. The autumn fair in Larkspur had always been more ritual than celebration. It marked the thinning of warmth, the harvest's last breath before frost came to claim what was left. Long tables sagged with pies and preserves. Children with sticky fingers clutched caramel apples. Fiddlers played tunes passed down from hands long buried. The whole affair smelled of cinnamon, sawdust, and nostalgia. But it had never smelled like Mabel. She had never come before, not once in 7 years. The townsfolk had grown used to her absence, the way they had grown used to not saying her name, to pretending her booth in Darrow's diner was merely a shadow that flickered in the corner. But when Jesse Boyd walked across the fairgrounds that afternoon, boot soles thudding across planks of the dance platform, and offered his hand without flourish or explanation, people paused. And then they watched her step forward. Her shawl was forest green, woolen but fine, threaded with gold that caught the late sun in flickers like autumn leaves just before they fall. She had braided her beard into 2 small twists, tied with pale yellow ribbon, not hidden, not apologized for, but adorned. It was the only time in all her days in Larkspur that she had dressed not to disappear, but to be seen. The fiddlers played on, unsure whether to falter or finish. They chose the latter. Jesse placed his hand on her waist like it was made for that place and no other. Mabel's fingers, rough from thread and ash, settled in his palm. And then they moved, slowly, not with practiced grace, but with reverence, as if this wasn't a dance, but a vow made in motion. Whispers slithered through the crowd like smoke through floorboards. Words like shameless and strange passed between lips, but no one stepped forward. No one dared. Because Jesse didn't flinch. He held her like she mattered, like she'd always mattered. Halfway through the waltz, under the twilight of a copper sky, he leaned in close, his breath warm against her temple, and said, "I meant it, Mabel. You look like a queen to me." It was not a line. It was a statement of fact. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she held them back. Not out of pride, but because she didn't want them to blur the moment. She wanted to remember it in sharp detail. The feel of Jesse's hand, the hush of the crowd, the violin note that caught like a bird's cry in her chest. After the song, silence gave way to something softer. The mayor's wife approached with a cup of lemonade and eyes less guarded than before. A schoolteacher asked about mending lessons. Faces that had once tightened in scorn began to slacken, to soften. And then came the little girl, hair like a halo of static, birthmark blooming across her chin, who tilted her head and said, with the certainty only children possess, "I like your beard. It's soft, like Grandma's cat." Mabel bent slowly, cupped the girl's hand in both of hers, and pressed a kiss to it as if she were royalty, because in that moment she was, not just seen, not merely tolerated, but treasured, finally, fully. And though the music played on and Jesse said nothing more, Mabel knew she had already heard everything she had ever needed.